All right, welcome back for another deep dive. You guys gave us quite the case this time. A true crime podcast about a murder that really shook up a quiet suburb back in 75. And let me tell you, this one's got more twists and turns than, well,
And then a roller coaster.
exactly. We're heading to Clintonville, Ohio. Picture like a classic American suburb where everyone knows everyone, the kind of place where you leave your door unlocked. And then, bam, 14-year-old Christy Mullins is found murdered. Suddenly, that peaceful facade just crumbles.
Yeah, it really throws the whole idea of safety into question, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So get ready, because we're about to unpack a case that kept this community on edge for decades.
What's really interesting here is how the initial assumptions about the killer were totally wrong. As the investigation unfolded, it wasn't just about finding who did it. It turned into this fight for justice against a system that seemed determined to pin the crime on the wrong person.
Okay, so let's set the scene. August 23rd, 1975, Christy goes missing after leaving the local pool with her classmate, Carol. Later that day, a man named Henry Newell, he's out with his family, and they discover Christy's body in the woods. It's behind a shopping center. A pretty gruesome scene. She'd been brutally beaten, hands tied.
It's the kind of event that just sends shockwaves through a community, living in a place where you felt safe and then this happens. It's a harsh reminder that even the most seemingly peaceful places, darkness can be lurking.
Totally. And the police, they don't find much physical evidence at the scene except for the murder weapon, a broken piece of wood. But they do have Carol's story, and she tells them about this strange phone call she got from a man claiming to be a radio DJ, inviting her to this cheerleading contest behind the shopping center, a contest that didn't even exist.
That phone call always sends chills down my spine. It directly connects to the crime scene, but the police just dismissed it as a prank.
Like, come on, how do you ignore something like that?
It's a classic example of what we call tunnel vision in investigations. When investigators get so focused on one theory that they miss or even ignore other potentially critical clues. And in this case, that oversight had some devastating consequences.
It makes you think how differently things could have gone if they had taken Carol's story seriously from the start. Now, even though the crime was so brutal, the autopsy showed there wasn't any evidence of sexual assault. But Chrissy's clothing was disheveled, so the motive remained a puzzle, and then the case takes a sudden turn with the arrest of Jack Carman.
And this is where the case takes a darker turn. Jack was a 25-year-old man with developmental disabilities. He got picked out based on a witness's description of someone running from the scene.
So they bring him in for questioning, and what comes next is a grueling 6-hour interrogation that ends with a confession. But, and this is the troubling part, the confession was full of inconsistencies and weird details that didn't add up.
Yeah, the podcast goes into detail about the interrogation, and it points out how Jack mainly gave one-word answers. If he answered at all, it raises serious concerns about whether he understood what was happening. And whether his confession was truly voluntary, you get the feeling that his vulnerability was taken advantage of.
Absolutely, and sadly, Jack's competency was never really assessed, and despite these red flags, he was quickly charged with murder and sentenced to life in prison.
It's a sobering reminder of how vital it is to protect the rights of vulnerable individuals, especially when it comes to the justice system.
But the story doesn't stop there. Doubts about Jack's guilt started to bubble up in the community. People were troubled by the holes in his confession and witness statements that just didn't line up. This wave of concern led to the creation of the Justice for Jack Committee. Basically, a group of people who refused to believe Jack was the killer and dedicated themselves to finding the truth.
The formation of this committee is a great example of the power of community action. They weren't just fighting for Jack. They were fighting for justice itself. They held rallies, they raised awareness, and eventually got Jack new legal representation.
It's pretty amazing what a determined group of people can accomplish. And at the same time, Christy's own father, Norman, was carrying out his own investigation. He was suspicious of Carol's story, thought she was hiding something. His search even led him to find men's clothing near the crime scene, potential evidence that the police had overlooked.
Norman's drive to find answers for his daughter is incredibly moving. It speaks to the deep mistrust that can develop when families feel like the justice system has failed them. And the fact that he found potential evidence the police missed just adds fuel to that fire.
Absolutely heartbreaking, especially considering he was dealing with the unimaginable grief of losing his daughter. But then, thanks to the tireless efforts of Jack supporters and the growing unease in the community, a glimmer of hope emerged in January of '77.
Right, the court finally threw out Jack's confession and his guilty plea. They acknowledged that his rights had been violated during the interrogation and that there were serious doubts about his competency to stand trial. a huge win for Jack's supporters, but it meant the investigation had to basically restart from scratch.
And with Jack's confession off the table, the focus of the investigation shifted in a major way.
The defense team for Jack's new trial, they decided to shift the focus, point the finger at someone else.
Henry Newell, the guy who first found Christy's body, remember, he was there with his wife and stepson when they came across that horrific scene.
Oh, yeah, and this is where things get really crazy. Turns out Henry's got this long rap sheet, arson, among other things. He was actually in jail, get this, for burning down his own house when Jack's new trial started.
Wow, talk about a plot twist.
But it gets even wilder. Remember the eyewitness account from Henry and his wife? About seeing a young man running away from the scene.
Yeah, I remember. Well, a store clerk came forward and said she saw Henry right after the murder. And guess what? He fit their description perfectly. Shirtless, scratched up, wearing cut-off jeans. It's like they were describing him all along.
That's pretty damning testimony. It really throws the reliability of the Newells as eyewitnesses into question. It makes you wonder, if Henry was the one running away, what was he even doing there in the first place?
Right. Almost like they were trying to set up a scapegoat from the get-go. And then, to add another layer of complexity, Henry's stepson Bobby, who was only 10 at the time, he testified, and he contradicted his mother's statements about where Henry was that day. Said Henry was gone for much longer than she initially claimed.
That's heartbreaking, but also incredibly significant. It suggests there was a deliberate attempt to cover up Henry's actions. Imagine the pressure on a 10-year-old to keep quiet about something like that.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Makes you wonder what else they might have been hiding. And if that wasn't enough, Pam's own mother, she testified too. She said she overheard Henry say something really disturbing about Christy after her death, implying that maybe he wanted to silence her.
All these little pieces of information about Henry, coming from people who knew him, start to paint a very different picture than the one presented at the beginning. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion and finding something rotten at the core.
It really is, and here's the kicker. A friend of Henry's came forward too, claiming that Henry had confessed to him about killing Christy, although he said it was an accident. So now you've got multiple people putting Henry at the scene, acting suspicious, even admitting to the crime.
And yet he was never charged with Christy's murder. It's mind-boggling. The prosecutor actually said he was hesitant to pursue charges against Henry, which sparked outrage in the community.
Understandably so. It feels like the justice system failed Christy and her family. But thankfully, their fight for the truth didn't end there. It took years of public pressure and relentless advocacy, but finally, in 2014, the case was reopened. This time, it was handled by a dedicated cold case unit.
The cold case unit, they took a fresh look at all the evidence, did new interviews, even found some degraded male DNA on Christy's clothing. Unfortunately, it couldn't be definitively linked to anyone, but their conclusion, after a grueling 18 months of investigation, was a bombshell. They were convinced that Henry Newell had killed Christy.
A long overdue acknowledgement of the truth. They also issued a public apology to the Mullins family for the botched investigation, acknowledging the incredible pain they'd endured.
But an apology, as we know, can never truly replace a loved one, especially under these circumstances.
It's true, and the fact that it took so long to get to this point just adds to the heartbreak.
Absolutely. The conclusion of the cold case investigation, while it brings some closure, also highlights the serious flaws in the original investigation. If they'd been more thorough, more open to different possibilities, maybe Christy's family wouldn't have had to wait decades for some semblance of justice.
It's a stark reminder that sometimes the people we think we know, our neighbors, the people we see every day, can be hiding some pretty dark secrets. And this case was full of secrets and deception.
The podcast really dives into Henry's past, uncovering a pattern of disturbing behavior. There were allegations of drug dealing and inappropriate relationships with local teenagers.
Yeah, that detail about Henry potentially giving teenagers drugs is really disturbing. Makes you wonder, were there other victims? Did his behavior escalate over time?
It's a chilling thought. And the episode also touches on the death of his wife, Pam, which was officially ruled as suicide. But her family believes Henry might have been involved, given his history of violence and control.
Another layer of tragedy added to this already horrific story makes you realize that Christy's case might just be the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Henry Newell's dark past. Now, before we move on to the final takeaways, I want to talk about John, the retired lawyer who played a key role in bringing the truth to light.
John's dedication to uncovering the truth is really remarkable. He spent years researching the case, going through old documents, conducting interviews, and ultimately he published a book that shed new light on Christy's murder. His work was crucial in reigniting public interest and pushing for the case to be reopened.
It really shows what one person's determination can achieve. And it's worth mentioning that his investigation was greatly helped by the detailed notes kept by Christy's father, Norman.
Norman's dedication to finding his daughter's killer, even in the midst of his grief, is truly inspiring. He never gave up hope, and his meticulous record-keeping played a huge role in making sure Christie's story wasn't forgotten.
Their combined efforts, along with the tireless work of the Justice for Jack Committee, demonstrate the impact that collective action can have. They refused to let Christie's case fade away, and their persistence ultimately led to the truth being acknowledged.
The podcast ends with a powerful message, encouraging listeners to come forward with any information they might have about unsolved cases. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to speak up and share what we know, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem.
Yeah, it's a call to action, reminding everyone that even years later, justice is still possible. Someone out there might have that missing piece of the puzzle, that information that could finally bring closure to this case or other unsolved crimes, and they might have been carrying that burden for far too long.
It's a powerful thought that we all have a role to play in holding those responsible accountable and ensuring that the victims are never forgotten. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Christie's case, what stands out to you as the biggest takeaway? I think for me, it's got to be the importance of critical thinking, questioning assumptions. This case was just full of them right from the start. The police, they assumed the phone call to Carol was a prank. They assumed Jack was guilty because of that forced confession. And for years, the community thought Henry Newell was this upstanding citizen.
Yeah, it's a harsh reminder that appearances can be deceiving. This case really shows how important it is to dig deeper, challenge the narrative, and not just settle for easy answers. How about you? What resonated with you the most?
What really struck me was the sheer resilience of everyone who fought for justice in this case. The Justice for Jack Committee, Norman's unwavering dedication to finding the truth, and John, the retired lawyer, spending years re-examining the case. They all demonstrate the power of individuals to make a real difference.
They just refuse to let Christie's case be forgotten. Their persistence is really inspiring. It reminds us that we should never underestimate our ability to create change.
Absolutely. This case, as tragic as it is, also offers a glimmer of hope. It shows that even when faced with what seem like impossible odds, the truth can eventually come out. But it also underlines how important it is to learn from the mistakes that were made.
Yeah, we have to make sure that the systemic failures that led to Jack's wrongful conviction and allowed Henry Newell to escape justice for so long are never repeated. We need better training for law enforcement, stronger protections for vulnerable people, and a justice system that puts truth and accountability above everything else.
Couldn't agree more. And as we close out our discussion, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. The story of Christy Mullins. It's not just a case from the past. It's a reflection of the ongoing struggle for justice that we see happening today.
It's a reminder to stay vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to never stop seeking the truth, no matter how long it takes. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a journey, that's for sure, with all its twists and turns, but ultimately, it leaves us with a renewed sense of hope. Remember, your voice matters, and you have the power to make a difference.